He is currently back in Boston teaching writing as a postdoctoral teaching associate in Northeastern University's writing program. The through line of Dr. Metzger's literary scholarship is exploring trauma and storytelling. His education research centers on supporting first-year students' transitions to college. Dr. Metzger's doctorate dissertation explores ways for faculty to use critical reflection and low-stakes writing to support students as they enter or return to college and to foster their growth as academic writers. He is a self-proclaimed dabbler, and current fixations include learning to play the guitar and piano and nursing his creative writing chops back to life. And he also prefers sheets over Wawa, which is just typical to me from someone from the great elite city of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, where Wawa is the only option, as it should be, across the state. And without further ado, I'm going to introduce Dr. Metzger, and I'm privileged to do so. I enjoy his work very much. So please, Dr. Metzger, take it away.
All right, thank you so much, Keith, for that introduction. And honestly, I've been missing both Wawa and Sheets since I've been in Boston. So we'll just put it there. Thank you, Keith. Thanks, Sam and Patrick, for inviting me. Thank you all for joining live or watching this later. I'm going to start by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you from the traditional homelands of the Mashpee Wampanoag and the Akinwa Wampanoag, among other indigenous peoples, and to acknowledge the Lenni Lenape people who originally inhabited the land of Northampton's campuses. I'd also like to dedicate this talk, given today, the 11th of November, 2021, 103 years since the signing of the armistice, which signaled the end of World War I, to our veterans and service members. Thank you for your service and sacrifice. Now, as a note, I am not an expert in this field, but I have much enjoyed reading and studying literature. And I'm not myself, nor have been in the armed services, though friends, family, and students of mine have. So again, I thank them for their service. In his foreword to a 2013 collection of contemporary veteran-penned short stories, writer Colum McCann states, "It is the job of literature to confront the terrible truths of what war has done and continues to do to us. It is also the job of literature to make sense of whatever small beauty we can rescue from the maelstrom." War literature serves as a record where veterans have documented their experiences and crafted stories. Those participants of American military conflicts who have utilized literature to shape their war narratives have formed a tradition in this country's literary culture. Since the American Civil War, veterans have used literature as a medium to present the domestic public with an account of what they've endured. War, it has often been said, is a surreal experience, as Stephen Crane made evident in his recreation of the Battle of Chancellorsburg in The Red Badge of Courage. Since World War II, recent wars of debated purposes have tested the credulity of those both directly and indirectly involved. And so war narratives of any kind, but as is the focus of this talk, fictional narratives, serve the purpose of recreation and elucidation of chaotic and confusing war experiences. So reading war literature is important because it gives shape, coherence, retrospection, and clarification to these surreal experiences of war. In other words, it shapes our imagination of war. Back in 2010, the Virginia Quarterly ran an editorial by Michael Lucas that questioned when American war novels set in Afghanistan and Iraq and written by participants of these conflicts would be published. Memoirs and long-form journalistic nonfiction appeared quite early, as is typical in war writing, but the question was, when will a novel appear? Lucas noted the approximate decade-and-a-half gap that historically exists between a given war and its popular novels. For example, the 16 years between the end of the Second World War and the publication of Joseph Heller's Catch-22, but suggested that, quote, veterans-only writing workshops in VA centers and military bases across the country might accelerate the emergence of veteran-written post-9/11 war novels. And in 2012, about a decade after these conflicts began, a novel written by veteran Kevin Powers was one of the first to appear on bookshelves. war novels to appear on bookshelves. Powers, an Army machine gunner who saw combat in Iraq in 2004 and 2005, and later earned his Master's of Arts or MFA in creative writing, published this novel, The Yellow Birds, in September of 2012. Powers' novel was immediately heralded as a modern masterpiece of post-9/11 desert warfare, namely of Operation Iraqi Freedom, as the war scenes in the novel are set in Al-Tafar, Iraq, a renaming of Tal Afar, the city where Powers spent most of his tour. So I'm going to continue presenting a sample of initial critical acclaim for that novel because, as they have in the past, responses and reactions to veteran writing serve as accurate gauges of public perception of the heart and soul of war. We'll then detour for a brief history lesson on 20th century war writing and literary trends established by soldiers who wrote about the Great and Second World Wars. And following that, I'll focus on Tim O'Brien's storytelling of the Vietnam War and his use of metafiction, so that we can then circle back to Powers' novel, reading some passages from it juxtaposed with O'Brien's work. I'll conclude by presenting exemplary titles of Iraqi contemporary war literature, as well as some information about organizations who host veteran writing workshops. So this is a spoiler alert, during my presentation of these novels, there are a few spoilers, but I assure you none will diminish your reading experience. I don't go into heavy plot detail. But here's a summary of The Yellow Birds. So Kevin Powers focuses his novel on narrator protagonist John Bartle, an Army machine gunner serving a one-year tour of duty in Iraq that begins in 2004, who tells his story from the US in 2009. Before their deployment, he'd promised to keep Murphy, his brother in arms, alive so he can be safely returned to his mother. But early on in the novel, it's made clear that he failed to keep this promise. Murphy's death defines Bartle's post-war reflection and conflict and the trauma that he dealt with, and is the central issue he dwells upon returning to the United States, where about half the novel is set. Structured non-linearly, the narrative explores Bartle's wartime trauma over several different geographic and temporal arenas. Adding to the conflict is this suggestion that Bartle and his superior officer, Sergeant Sterling, are suspects of war crimes surrounding Murphy's death. So Powers' narrative vision implies that a veteran's memory of their war can never be wholly reimagined. The tensions in this novel are often left unresolved or ignored by the protagonist, which further suggests the futility in a veteran's ability to live an adjusted post-war life. And that's really was at the core of my talk and a lot of the literature that I have studied. The novel commanded a lot of attention when it was published, including being a finalist for the 2012 National Book Award and earning Powers the 2013 Penn Hemingway Award. To highlight just some of the acclaim of the Yellow Birds received, scholars said that Powers' tour of duty in Iraq, filtered through the craft he learned while earning his MFA, made him someone who not only had an important story to tell, but one who possessed the skills to utilize the novel form to tell it masterfully. Benjamin Percy of the New York Times pointed to the nonlinear, disjointed timeline as one which turns the reader into, quote, active participants who must piece together details of the trauma Bartle has endured alongside the narrator instead of as removed observers, strengthening this reciprocity of a shared experience between veteran and reader. And to the point that I made earlier about fiction informing public perception of war, Danny Noel of Oxford American highlighted the ability of the Yellow Birds to transcend the influence and, quote, absurdity of the 24-hour news cycle, end quote, that badgers the public with its war reportage, which, as the Daily Beast's Doug Stanton suggests, deprive them of what they really need, the public of what they really need. A story told in, quote, a way so granular and humane that we sense the tragedy. The Yellow Birds offered the American public a story of the War on Terror in the form of literary art, a form which had been absent from public consciousness about military conflict since before 9/11, and a form which has uniquely informed the public of previous American conflicts. So compared to the war literature of other nations, the American war novel is relatively young, as are most things in America, comparatively. Stephen Crane's Red Badge of Courage, published in full in 1895, is one of the first to enter America's war novel canon. The novel gained immediate popularity, but Red Badge was one of the few fictional renderings of the Civil War. Most prose from that conflict exists as memoirs, diaries, and letters written by the participants. And that's not unique to the Civil War. The progression of war literature and fiction relies on these historical accounts, journals, and memoirs. Fiction is really the least popular literary medium that soldiers use to tell their stories in any conflict. So now for that brief history lesson on 20th century war writing, I'll introduce you to two literary historians and veterans of the Second World War, Paul Fussell and Samuel Hines, whose research provides invaluable accounts about how veterans utilized literary mediums to share their experiences. Fussell's focus on World War I, particularly in The Great War and Modern Memory, though focused on British writers, is essential to the evolution of the American war novel. According to Fussell, although many had an awareness of classic war literature, Americans in World War I were devoid of a war literary tradition. That's literature written about American military conflicts by its participants, especially when compared with their British allies. But World War I was arguably the first in which common American soldiers were well read. And that's partially explained because by this time, classic and modern texts were being made more readily available in portable volumes published by World Classics and Everyman's Library. So American soldiers were, and all soldiers really, were able to take these, the prose from Shakespeare, Thomas Hardy, Rudyard Kipling, and others into the trenches. A better read soldier was one more likely to keep written records as diary entries or poems, fostering an emerging literary tradition of the common soldier, whereas prior accounts came nearly exclusively from officers. Memoir and poetry tended to be the dominant medium, dominant medium for soldiers who wrote about the Great War, but there's this interesting shift when novels start to become more prevalent. And Fussell points to the contrast between autobiographical and fictional war writing. So a veteran fiction writer recreates where a memoirist recaptures war experiences, articulating this shift in war storytelling from biographical to fictive. The fiction writer is both storyteller and historian, making them an invaluable recorder of military conflict. And I would argue that's what really makes war fiction so interesting to read. In The Soldier's Tale, bearing witness to modern war, Samuel Hines envisions this universal war story told over time by the innumerable participants of war. Soldiers' stories, according to Hines, provide insight not only to war, but to the process of narrativizing the experience of combat. Veterans tell their stories both to make sense of the experience for themselves and to try to explain what they experienced to others, providing narratives that make significant progress towards realizing the impact participating in war has on an individual's psyche. Soldiers ask questions of their wars and answer them in the telling of their story, finding meaning and getting their, quote, war straight in their mind. Getting war straight can also be applied to the reciprocation of veterans' war narratives by readers after their work is published, shaping our imagination and memory of war. So 20th century war writing also led to this emergence of literary techniques that would become characteristic of the genre, specifically focused, individualized narration, and the widespread use of irony and metaphor. Soldiers discussed their aggravation when receiving orders from superior officers, recounted the, quote, hopes and illusions of newly enlisted troops, and told of wartime killing. These were stories that offered a significantly different perspective of the war than what was delivered to civilians by British government policy and propaganda. And aware that their stories contrasted those messages from the government, veteran-written novelists developed intrinsically ironic tones. And this use of irony was certainly not unique to British writers, but a convention of the genre of war fiction. In All Quiet on the Western Front, a novel of the Great War, German novelist Erich Remarque effectively uses ironic tone and imagery with butterflies landing on skulls in no man's land, juxtaposing natural beauty and man-made destruction, and the irony in any one side of the conflict being named a victor in the end. Irony and ironic metaphor are prevalent among war novels, perhaps more than any rhetorical or figurative device. Veteran writers use of these devices also change with each conflict, allowing us to gauge the attitudes that soldiers held about their specific war. Now, we can't closely read the Yellowbirds until the writing of another major conflict is mentioned, and that's the Vietnam War. During press junket interviews with Kevin Powers, one writer's name came up frequently of that conflict, and that's Tim O'Brien, who you see pictured here. O'Brien pioneered an extremely self-aware approach to war writing, mastering metafictional techniques that embody the nearly impossible task of war storytelling. I know we've been hearing meta a lot lately, but in a literary context, Patricia Waugh helps us define metafiction as, quote, fictional writing which self-consciously and systematically draws attention to its status as an artifact in order to pose questions about the relationship between fiction and reality. Metafictive narratives often defy conventional storytelling techniques such as chronology and decipherable plot, favoring this displacement of time and blurring the distinction between author, narrator, and character. Employing metafiction, O'Brien is able to simultaneously portray and question the truth of what happens to the individual in war and how they remember those events. His best-selling and critically praised interrelated story collection, The Things They Carried, is a piece comprised of episodic and intertwined vignettes, which represents the height of his metafiction. Unlike the war literature that preceded its publication, this work is neither classifiable as novel or memoir. Instead, its ambiguous form reflects the ambiguity of truth as presented in its content. So storytelling is really the most important topic for the book. American Soldiers' Experience Fighting in Vietnam is a close runner-up. And if you have not read this book, I implore you to do so definitely before you read The Yellowbirds as well. A focus on two of O'Brien's books, his 1978 novel Going After Casiato, where a unit of American soldiers leave Vietnam to search for the title character who's believed to have gone AWOL to Paris, and The Things They Carried, juxtaposed with The Yellowbirds, reveals that there's these two great similarities between Powers and O'Brien, and that's the emphasis on the relationship between war and memory and the use of this ironic metaphor. However, one striking difference between Powers and O'Brien is their use of character. O'Brien develops a large number of characters reflective of a squad, where Powers, a squad as in a unit in the military, where Powers focuses on just three, Bartle, Murphy, and Sergeant Sterling, while there are other on the peripheral, those are definitely the central characters. O'Brien often depicts the characters as a singular unit in which becomes a character in and of itself. So they, as you see in the title, or the group's experience is described as much, if not more, than any individual characters. Trauma is experienced collectively and individually, and grappling with this demands a new relationship with memory, which O'Brien distinguishes as story truth and happening truth. Happening truth, or the actual way something occurred, rarely captures the psychological ramifications that can only be fully realized when telling an embellished narrative. So while parts may be fabricated, the story truth of a war story is often more realistic for the storyteller and the veteran. Although The Yellowbirds is not as overtly concerned with the nature of storytelling as The Things They Carried and Going After Casiato, Powers' use of Bartle as a particularly reflective narrator has the novel engage with memory, narrative, and the representation of past events. In these moments, O'Brien's influence on Powers is undeniable. In one of the many times Bartle thinks back on the war, he actually seems to paraphrase O'Brien's notions on these two truths, saying, quote, "Half of memory is imagination anyway," which also suggests that at times the storyteller himself does not possess, or does not always possess, a frame of reference for what is true. So now we'll do some close reading, and that's the English teacher in me is gonna really love this, and hopefully you will too. So the process of remembering causes endless frustration as delineated in this passage from the Yellow Birds. For every memory I was able to pull up, another seemed to fall away forever. There was some proportion about it all, though. It was like putting a puzzle together from behind, the shapes familiar, the picture quickly fading, the muted tan of the cardboard backing a tease at wholeness and completion. This remembering is fraught with futility. However proportional the individual memories seem, the parts will never add up, leaving the picture of the past incomplete. This suggests that a complete vision of the past might exist. The veteran possesses the memories or the puzzle pieces. However, the process of rendering those memories into a contained narrative result in the realization that recreating a whole conception of the past is futile. O'Brien's Cassiato narrative provides a similar concept. War stories, that was what remained. What remained was simple event, the facts, the physical things, a war like any war, no new messages, stories that began and ended without transition, no developing drama or tension or direction, no order. This ultimatum suggests the memories that dominate a veteran's imagination cannot be rendered into a sensible narrative. Those events remain unchangeable, chaotic, meaningless, like the back of Bartle's jigsaw puzzle. Another scene from the Yellow Birds reveals an epiphany of Bartle's as he dwells on reassembling memories from a prison cell in Fort Knox. I developed the habit of making a mark on my cell wall when I remembered a particular event, thinking that at some later date, I could refer to it and assemble all the marks into a story that made sense. Eventually, I realized that all the marks could not be assembled into any kind of pattern. They were fixed into place. Connecting them would be wrong. The significance of these passages echo O'Brien's need to confront both happening and story truths. And in this moment here, the Yellow Birds is particularly metafictive. Powers uses a contrived narrative to present a veteran protagonist who concludes that making sensible order out of the past is impossible, which explains the fragmented nonlinearity of the novel itself, and also reflects a lot of Kevin Powers himself in John Bartle. Bartle suggests that the ordering of the events he remembers would be wrong, not because he's interested in the principles of aesthetics or narrative, but because it contradicts a rule of his personal ethics. Powers' choice in positioning his chapters as temporally disjointed and fragmented is explained in this epiphany as the reflection of Bartle's own relationship with the process of remembering. So as I discussed, irony and metaphor are conventions of the genre of war literature, and these figurative devices are evident in both O'Brien's and Powers' use of the war. We actually see this in earlier war novels, such as the arguably most acclaimed American war novel, Ernest Hemingway's A Farewell to Arms. During the second exchange between Frederick Henry and Catherine Barclay, the war is acknowledged and quickly shunned from conversation. Frederick starts by saying, "Let's drop the war." Catherine replies, "It's very hard. There's no place to drop it." To which he replies, "Let's drop it anyway." In Cassiato, O'Brien introduces the war on the title's first page, describing it as this omnipresent, gloomy force, saying, quote, "The war was cold and pasty and rotten, and everywhere the war was wet, and the war was always the same." And in the things they carried, O'Brien's characters ask, "How was the war today?" And his narrator explains that, quote, "For the common soldier, at least, war has the feel, the spiritual texture of a great ghostly fog, thick and permanent." O'Brien employs the war as a presence constantly felt and described by his characters. The war, of course, is also something that his characters are both participants of and an event that is constantly happening all around them. Attributing descriptors to the war is a move that establishes it as this ironic metaphor. And where Hemingway's war appeared as an intrusion into casual conversation, O'Brien's war is much like weather or the atmosphere of the jungle. Now, Powers continues to use the war as ironic metaphor, personifying it in nuanced ways that claim it as distinctively belonging to his novels post 9/11 conflict. And so we'll look at the very first page of The Yellow Birds. Bartle narrates, "The war tried to kill us in the spring. While we slept, the war rubbed its 1,000 ribs against the ground in prayer. When we pressed onward through exhaustion, its eyes were white and open in the dark. While we ate, the war fasted, fed by its own deprivation. It made love and gave birth and spread through fire. The war sent its citizens wrestling into the shade of white buildings. It cast a white shade on everything like a veil over our eyes. It tried to kill us every day, but it had not succeeded. While I slept that summer, the war came to me in my dreams and showed me its sole purpose, to go on, to only go on. And I knew the war would have its way." Power's narrator immediately personifies, like page 3 really, immediately personifies the war as an entity threatening the lives of Bartle and his fellow soldiers. He gives the war human attributes that are suggestive of specific cultural identifications. The war participates in Islamic prayer rituals, as Bartle explains how it, quote, rubbed its 1,000 ribs against the ground in prayer. Powers attributes the war's characteristics to a culture and a geography. Although we can identify the specificity of the war's personification, there's also another reading to consider. And that's that this opening passage suggests that the war is presented as the sole harbinger of the novel's conflict. Though we see its symbolic traits of personification, the war is never defined as an armed conflict over territory or ideology, but as this amorphous being whose descriptors suggest this murderous, unstoppable enemy. And really, Bartle never says enemy, insurgents, or Iraqis in the opening passage. Instead, the source of conflict and danger is the war, a placeholder, really, for the multitude of threatening forces his protagonist fears. Portraying the war this way redirects the source of this specific conflict, Operation Iraqi Freedom, to war itself, an event as old as humanity and something that cannot be pinned to one nation, group of people, or singular brand of politics. So early in The Yellow Birds, Bartle calls upon the American wars that were fought in the past and the men who carried arms in their country's service during those conflicts, saying, quote, "I thought of my grandfather's war, how they had destinations and purpose." By presenting this distinction between past and present, Powers evokes the memory of a lineage of American soldiers. O'Brien's Cassiato narrator does the same, or one of his characters does the same. This passage, a standard against which Bartle measures his own war's purposelessness and his dwindling sense of belonging, likewise serves as Powers' recognition of other soldiers' meditations through past war literature. And however disconnected from the ideals that he holds up as admirable from previous generations of soldiers, Bartle's evocation of the men who fought in the Second World War also serves to parallel the way that he recounts this annual fighting that's going on in Tal Afar, Iraq, saying, "We'd march into a city that had fought this battle yearly, a slow, bloody parade to mark the change of season. We'd drive them out, we always had, we'd kill them. While we patrolled the streets, we'd throw candy to their children with whom we'd fight in the fall, a few years from now." This sentiment reveals an absurdity to this perpetual tug of war for the position of a single city in Iraq. It raises, from a soldier's perspective, the question as to why the fighting continues and when it might end. And reading it now, in 2021, after the withdrawal of American troops from the Middle East, provides a sentiment of cyclical numbness and violence that readers will without question view differently than when the words were penned or originally published. And while I cannot speculate on the nature of these differing interpretations, it should be clear by now that war fiction from veteran authors is crucial, and I would argue undervalued insight to war, breaking that constant drone of the 24-hour news cycle, providing service members and civilians glimpses into the experiences of American troops. And so as I wind down here, I do just want to recognize the bulk of the talk is centered on this lineage of American war literature about veteran written war novels. But that's not to say that in any way discount the literature from Iraqi writers, war literature from other nations. Here are just a few titles of novels from contemporary Iraqi writers that have been translated into English. So you'll see Frankenstein in Baghdad, that was shortlisted for the International Booker Prize in 2018. The Corpse Exhibition and Iraq Plus 100, American Granddaughter, The Tobacco Keeper, and the Book of Collateral Damage. I will admit that the only one I can personally recommend is the Corpse Exhibition, which is a fantastic collection of short stories and gives, just so many glimpses into other perspectives than just American written American written war literature. And also, though the scope of my talk is confined to Kevin Powers, there's much more contemporary American written fiction to consider. In 2014, veteran Phil Clay's Redeployment won the National Book Award. And actually, in my reading, Clay's narrators tend to share a lot more traits with O'Brien's and war fiction as a genre, more so than Yellowbirds. Clay's 2020 novel Missionaries also met really high praise, including being selected as one of the best books of 2020 by Barack Obama. I've yet to read this one yet. Maybe one of you can recommend it to me personally. And this collection, Fire and Forget, short stories from the Long War, that's where the Colum McCann quote came from at the very beginning. That's a collection of veteran written short stories. And Matt Gallagher and Roy Scranton edit that, and they also contribute to that. It leads me into this, something that I kind of previewed for you, but this idea of veterans, contemporary veterans writing and actively writing their stories in MFA programs, in VA Center writing workshops, and veteran written writing workshops. So this is just a very, very short list of some of the maybe most popular of these programs that are available for veterans to get involved in, to write, not just fiction, but memoir, poetry, what have you. And I will note that the Warrior Writers does have a New Jersey branch, online events. They have a 1 o'clock workshop today. And many college and universities also host workshops and classes. So for example, I'm familiar with like UMass Boston's, and NCC's neighbor, Moravian College, also offers some of these. So that is what I have. I'm very thankful for your time and attention. And again, thanks to our vets for their service and sacrifice. Please keep telling your stories. And I guess it's on to the Q&A, Keith.
Well, that's excellent. Thank you so much for their talk. It was very fascinating, especially for me as a fellow English teacher. I wanted to ask you to kick off the Q&A, and I want to remind everyone, if I haven't already told you, you can put your questions in the chat, and I'll throw them at Dan for you via my voice, which is so beautiful. But first, you're going to hear my beautiful voice ask Dan, because though we are English teachers, we kind of come at it from a different perspective. I'm definitely more rooted in psychoanalysis and Freud, and you came at it from very formal, with using irony and how all these working parts within these books work together to tell these war stories. And I wanted to ask you, so of the works you discussed, which do you find most effective in terms of response, or evoking stronger responses maybe in yourself or students you've shared these books with, or maybe if you've worked with veteran authors yourself?
Yeah, thank you. That's definitely a great question. And honestly, my knee-jerk response is The Things They Carried by Tim O'Brien. Probably that was the book, I think, when I was 16 or 17 years old when I first read that in high school. It really just had that, evocative, like emotive response from me. And it wasn't just about, and sometimes I get this question. I remember my dad asking me, why are you so into war literature? Like, you're not, in the service, you're not like, I have like friends, my brother-in-law is, right? But it's this idea that it does speak to that trauma or storytelling to work through trauma and reorganizing your memories. So I think that, I mean, I personally have experienced trauma. I think we all have in some way. So that's why there's really a broad audience for it. And that psychoanalysis, right, of like what is experienced firsthand. So I have not experienced war firsthand, but you can experience that from someone's writing, from just asking them, hey, how'd things go over there, right? Like the idea of just storytelling, I think, is so important. And Tim O'Brien like breaks it down like beautifully, poetically too.
Thank you so much for that answer. It's awesome. And yeah, I had a similar experience reading different fiction that's rather, I guess you'd say, related to trauma, where my parents are like, we think you're sick. But I also wanted to ask that, so do you feel Powers and O'Brien, you mentioned they somewhat relate more than the others, right? Did I get that right? In terms of their works?
Yeah, and it might help. So the majority of the research and what I just shared was based around my master's thesis at UMass Boston, and that was done I was there from 2012 to 2014. So Yellowbirds had just come out, and there was a lot of parallels that I was seeing and that other critics were seeing to Tim O'Brien. Like if it hadn't been for Tim O'Brien, right, like Kevin Powers probably wouldn't have been able to write that book that way. So yeah.
So I was going to ask too is, and I guess this is a little psychoanalytical, from the cultural sense, both those wars, or the American armed intervention in the Middle East and Vietnam are probably two of our most apprehensive conflicts, with a lot of controversy. Do you think that the similarity between how, I guess you could say, Americans, including soldiers themselves, reacted to the invasion of Iraq, and that we found no weapons of mass destruction, and the disillusionment with Vietnam, do you think that relates their stories a little bit more than, as opposed to like relating them to Civil War stories?
Yeah, absolutely. So even getting into that very last part where Powers talks about that kind of tug of war over the one city, where it's like a cyclical fight, like every year you can set your watch to it almost. It's go by the seasons.
Wow,
that
is amazing.
That's the narrators and the characters in O'Brien's work are questioning why they're there. They're questioning the purpose, right? But they're also grappling with duty and you know that they've enlisted, or some of them were drafted.
Of course.
But there's definitely that same, and I don't know if it was in what I presented, but you know, wars of you know, questionable purpose, or you know, it's not just that the American public are wondering these things, but stories from the soldiers themselves, and even, you know, the first Gulf War, and this is a memoir, but Anthony Swofford's Jarhead is really kind of doing the same thing. He's like, I'm just doing this, you know, like he didn't really necessarily feel like he had a purpose for it.
That is another one, definitely very striking. Anthony Swofford's Jarhead, without doubt. At present, I don't see anything in the chat. So, I mean, I wrote down tons of questions I have because I'm fascinated. And here's from Daria. If I'm saying that wrong, please forgive me. She asked, hello, Professor Metzger. What book on the war topic would you recommend for those who are not very acquainted with war literature?
Daria, thank you. One of my former students. I would, that's a good question. And I'm probably going to say The Things They Carried by Tim O'Brien. However, there are actually, you know what might be a better way to also explain that, and I don't have it with me, but I don't have it on me. The collection of short stories that Fire and Forget, it's called, Short Stories from the Long War, that I mentioned there at the end. That is really good to give you kind of like a taste of what veterans are writing about. Oftentimes, one thing that's very characteristic of the genre is that they're writing about homecoming and grappling with what was going on in whatever conflict they were involved in. And again, that kind of question about memory and how those memories intrude, or they can't connect with them, or they can't connect with people around them, and how they've been changed that way, which again makes it really, whether it's memoir, poetry, fiction, short story, novel, whatever it is, it really speaks to the fact that these are living, breathing people who we as non-service members or fellow vets or servicemen and women should be engaging with and listening to and asking, for their stories. But the one thing about the genre of war literature, and it's not so much in the Yellowbirds, which I would highly recommend that anyone read. There's a lot of vulgar language. There's a lot of acronyms that are military acronyms. So I remember preparing a lesson on just the short story of the things they carried, and handing out like a cheat sheet for these for students, because, and even myself, you need to, they don't give you, how we do it in academic writing, like the full title and then, continue referring to it. It's just like, boom, you're in there. So it might seem a little like, you might feel a little like disengaged at first, but you just need to kind of ease yourself into it and be ready for some rough language and some sometimes like, graphic scenes.
That sounds straight up my alley, if I'm going to be honest. I love the gonzo, just right in the moment kind of style, right in the middle of it. So we have another question from Mr. William White. Have you read Matterhorn? I believe that is written by a Marine Corps veteran of Vietnam. And if so, what is your opinion on it?
So I actually have not read Matterhorn, William. But I would love to, if you went on mute and share any of your thoughts on it. Like I said, I was going into this thinking I would definitely get some good recommendations from anyone in attendance. So I'll add it to my list for sure. I mean, I've heard of it.
Yeah, I thought it was excellent. It's a long novel. I thought it was really, really good. It took him 20 years to write it, I believe. He was a veteran, and I was just curious if you had read it. I would definitely recommend it though.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, no, I will be adding it to my list. There's books that I even mentioned in my talk that I haven't fully read. So I definitely have a list going. Thank you.
So if there are any more questions, oh, sorry.
Question, I think, Keith. Marcelo?
Am I cut off? Did I get cut off? Oh, yeah, I did get cut off. Thank you for catching that. Sorry about that, Marcelo. I apologize. My chat cut you out for a minute. Tim O'Brien is quoted as saying, "A true war story is never moral. It does not instruct, nor encourage virtue, nor suggest models of proper human behavior, nor restrain men from doing things men have always done. If a story seems moral, do not believe it." Do you believe this viewpoint is pivotal to any author who is seeking to write a war story in the hopes of not glorifying the conflict and seeming biased to their own service or the possible political viewpoints of the war? Your thoughts?
So I love that question and that quote as well, from the things they carried. I guess my opinion or my sentiment from my study, again, not my experience, but actively participating, is that I resonate with that idea that the hopes of not glorifying the conflict. So there's kind of a distinction, and I don't have great examples of the glorifying of war. Some of those are novels that I'm usually not interested in. I'm really interested in this retrospective, kind of healing process that storytelling is doing. And that's why I think you can't just go in and tell, these are the events, this is the information, this is what you could have observed. There's a lot of great long form journalism. There's a lot of really great experiences from those journalists who actually oftentimes become, it becomes a place for them to work through what they're seeing as well. And it cannot just be straightforward and objective. So I don't think, I don't know if I'm answering your question, but that is, there's kind of this distinction where maybe you should distrust, or you should kind of ask more probing questions of the story itself or of the teller, if there is kind of like, it seems like a superficial glossing over just presentation of events or glorifying it. We have tabloids and newspapers to do that, right? So this is something that is a form of art that, you know, can really express the trauma and the futility of recreating that story in any sensible order. So I think you just kind of have to roll with it when you're writing that story.
Awesome. Yeah, that really was an excellent question. And I, again, apologize for missing it. I do not want anyone to miss their questions. So thank you, Marcelo, for that answer, that question. And thank you, Dan, for the answer. So it seems there are no more questions, and we are getting close to the end of the time. So I want to thank Dan again for coming to Spartan Talks and giving us a great Veterans Day, a lot to reflect on. So thank you, Dan. And one thing that comes to mind as we close out our Spartan Talk this Veterans Day, I'd like to join Dan in thanking members of the service for their resiliency, for their sacrifices, for what they've endured. And I will go as well and say that we shouldn't forget as well that many wars before, a lot of folks, whether African American, Japanese American women, were underappreciated for their service. The 442nd Go for Broke Battalion, for example, is the most decorated unit in American military history at this point for its size, and it was all Japanese Americans, and they fought in the European theater of World War II. The Montford Point Marines, African Americans who were not allowed to train at Parris Island, trained at Montford Point and were deployed to Iwo Jima, where Kenneth Tibbs was the first African American Marine to die for his country, and a country that didn't appreciate his sacrifice. So as Dan said, even though those of us who did not serve in conflicts for this country, we do have to remember that there are people still suffering from the battles they fought. So thank you again, Dan.
Yeah, can I just add, that's
Please
actually
do.
something that I have fully noticed is, like, you know, representation of whose stories have been published and told over, you know, the centuries, and that you know, again, that spirit of asking vets to tell their stories, and asking, you know, looking at I mean, the focus of all the writers that I looked at, and most of the canon is white male writers, and that is a cultural characteristic of the military as well. So there are not, like you said, Keith, like, and thank you for pointing that out. That's not to diminish the service of others. And Kayla Williams has a memoir, "Love My Rifle More Than You." Yeah. So that's one, you know, there are some examples, but I think that's, you know, something that is definitely a point to consider, whose stories are being told, even among, you know, a group that we don't hear a whole lot from, you know, in terms of servicemen.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you again, Dan, and thank you everybody who tuned in for this Spartan Talk. Unfortunately, we have to conclude it. But I would love to hear an update next year, Dr. Metzger. So thank you very much, and keep at your research. I love what you're doing, and I'm sure we all feel that way as well.
Thank you.
So thank you.
Thank you.
And have a good day, everyone, as we close out.